Thank you, Choa, for that wonderful introduction. Uh, what Choa didn't tell you is I do have a wicked sense of humor, and I always get a chuckle whenever I hear the Gatha on opening the sutra. We chanted another version of what you've just chanted in my Zendo, but I happened to have been in San Francisco at the early part of January, and I went to San Francisco Zen Center. And the Gatha was something like whatever the I promise to hear, see, eat, the Tathagata's words. And then I also found out that I think it might be Los Angeles, they say this, you know, we believe whatever the Tathagata's words, but even if we don't believe it. So I thought, well, this is interesting, either we eat the words of the Buddha or we don't believe the words of the Buddha. But the idea of a sutra is that it's basically two leaves that are sewn together, and words are written on it. And so I often think about when a talk is being given, what are we sewing ourselves into? And how does that involve our practice? I was recently came across a quote from Charlotte Joku Beck, in which she was having lunch with some of her students, and she overheard one of her longtime students say to another, "Are you tasting or judging?" And I think that's something that, especially at this time, not just in the world, but in our country, how is our practice informed? Are we tasting it or are we judging it? And people come to Buddhism for a number of reasons. Maybe they are looking to find something that's going to make their life easier, excuse me, or maybe they're looking for something else that's going to change the circumstances around them. And that's something that I think we really have to tease out. Why am I here? Why am I involved in this practice? Am I tasting or am I judging? Sometimes it's the feeling that maybe we engage in this practice to get enlightened, whatever that means. When I first came to the practice, I was looking for enlightenment, and I had an impression about what enlightenment looked like. It was like somebody who was cool, who was very reserved, and was like Teflon. You could say anything, and it would just fall right off. I would be cool with that. It's all about strength, really. It's all about strength. But then I've learned over, in the course of my practice, that it's not about looking cool or being like Teflon. And it's not about getting an A. You do everything right to get something. I think that's one of the many, and I would say pitfalls of the practice, is that we're always looking for something. And those of you who are familiar with Buddhism and who've studied know that the teachers say, guess what? We're already enlightened. It's just that we don't know it. So how do we begin to address those pitfalls and seriously ask our question, especially at this time? Are we tasting what we're doing, or are we judging? Are we waiting for something to happen? Or this is what it looks like. I got it. I went to Spain just about 2 years ago. And I had one of those moments. I was at the airport and I just saw all these people. And I mean, I've been to airports before, but in this particular situation, it was kind of unusual. But I saw all these people either getting off planes, getting on planes, making connections, staff, concession workers, and all of that. And it dawned on me that I was connected to these people. And that left a rather interesting taste in my mouth. I had no idea who these people were, but I was connected to them. And they were connected to me. How does that inform how I interact with whoever's in front of me, or whoever I talk to, or whoever I see on the screen? Am I tasting or am I judging? In the one of the books called The Gateless Barrier, there's a wonderful story about our sixth patriarch, Huineng, who was born in southeast China. He was born into a rather poor family. His father had died when he was 3 years old, and education was impossible. But he was built, so he was able to yield an axe, and support his mother by chopping wood. And the story goes that one day while he was selling wood, he heard a priest reciting the Diamond Sutra. And Huineng was so moved and had a good understanding of the teaching that he wanted to go to a monastery. So he left his family. He went went north, and he went to the monastery of the fifth patriarch, who goes by many names, but one of his names was Master Hong Ren. And there's a wonderful exchange that happens between the two of them. Ren says, "Why do you come here? Where do you come from?" Huineng said, "From the southeast." Ren asked, "What are you seeking?" Huineng said, "I want to become a Buddha." Ren said, "You monkeys from the southeast have no Buddha nature. How do you expect to become a Buddha?" Huineng replied, "There is a distinction of south and north for a person, but you cannot distinguish Buddha nature or not from a person's location." Ren realized that Huineng was quite in touch with the teachings, better than his monks. But since he wasn't educated, since he was illiterate, he was signed to clean rice. Until one day, Ren decided to retire, and he declared a contest. It sounds like something out of a fairy tale, but it's not. And it was a poetry contest in which who had a better sense of a particular kind of teaching. And so all the monks thought there was a stellar monk in the monastery who was sure to want to be the successor. But since Huineng understood what was going on, he asked one of the monks to write a verse for him on the wall. And when Ren observed the writings on the wall, he knew it was Huineng who was his successor. And so the story goes that there was a secret ceremony in which Ren gave him the symbols of his office, the robe and Buddha bowl, and told him to leave and go back home and start his own monastery. Well, of course, this caused an uproar in the monastery, because how could this hick be a Buddha? So a bunch of them took off and went after him. And their story is that the monks caught up to Huineng and demanded that he give back the robe and the bowl. And so the story again goes, Huineng put down the bowl and says, "You can take it." So the monk who was leading the charge, his name was Ming, goes to grab the bowl, but he couldn't pick it up. He couldn't pick up the bowl and the robe. He says, "All I want is to learn the Dharma. That's all I want." And Wen said, well, there's no secret. Let go of what is true and what is not, and reflect on your own true face. The truth will be discovered within you. That's where it abides. Let go of what is true and what is not, and reflect on your own true face. And then you'll find it resides in you. I have a special fondness for the sixth patriarch, especially when that little exchange earlier on when he's called a monkey. You monkeys from the southeast, you don't have Buddha nature. Many times in my life, I've been called a monkey. No one's ever called me a monkey directly to my face, but I remember in certain times in my professional life, I was told I had to go to the servants' entrance of a building instead of go through the front door. I remember earlier on, I used to work as a social worker in Harlem, and I made home visits. And I called a woman on the phone to announce that I was coming to see her. And she opened the door and she said, Mr. Smith? And I said, yes. And she looked me up and down and she says, you don't look how you sound. Definitely an impression about what a voice is like on the phone. And then when you meet that person, it's something completely different. So we all have, I believe, an impression of what the truth of what the Buddha is. And here's a story that says a man who can read or write is able to find a truth about himself. And that's what I believe, I think the person who mentioned why he came to Sweetwater to learn about Buddhism is to find out what's called your true face. There is the koan. I mean, some of you studied koan. What is your original face before your parents gave it to you? Or, I've heard another version, what was your original face before the world destroyed it? We are all involved with each other. There are no distinctions. That's our practice. That's our practice. There are no distinctions. And how do we support each other in remembering that? As much as we hear in the media of what's going on, there are no distinctions. And it's very easy to fall back and make a distinction. And our practice says no, we don't make distinctions. And we have to continue to ask ourselves, when we do this practice, am I tasting it or am I judging it? This is what Buddhism looks like. This is not what Buddhism looks like. This is Zen. This is not Zen. The Buddha didn't have to say much about what Buddha nature is all about. He just said, live it. He said a lot more, but he said, live it. That's what I believe we are all tasked to do. Enlightenment is already here. It's not a stage. It's already here. And our job is, or I like to think, not a job, but our fill in the blank is to be kind and be of service. In a discerning way. So I leave you with that to chew on. And I'd like to share a story with you that was shared by a man by the name of Tim Burkett, who was a guiding teacher in Minnesota. And the story goes something like this. It was a young man who was pressed into fighting the Trojan War. He was made an archer. And he fought for 10 years in the Trojan War. And when the war was finally over, he was much older. He had no wife, no family, and he had never loved anyone. And he wandered around for many months before he stumbled across a monastery where the monks were devoted to archery, not as a means of war, but as a spiritual practice, to cultivate a calm heart and deep concentration. After 10 years of being surrounded by death and vulgar warriors, he yearned to experience the quiet and calm of these priests, and he begged the abbot to allow him to stay. 10 years, the warrior lived with the monks. When he had perfected his skill as an archer, the abbot said, "You have perfected your skill as an archer. There is nothing more we can do for you here." But the man's heart was still that of a warrior. He was not at peace. He argued and pleaded with the abbot. "My heart is not yet at peace." But the abbot would not change his mind. "What you are seeking is not here. Perhaps you will find it in the outside world." He was much older now, and older still, found himself without no family and no home. And he had no love in his heart, but he felt very bitter. He became a swindler, tricking young, arrogant archers to challenge him and would take their money when they lost. After swindling for 10 years, he made his way back to his original home. And he figured if he go back there, he might make from other people to swindle and make more money. And as he was coming close to his place of birth, his town, he noticed that on certain trees, there was a bullseye with an arrow in the center. And as he got closer and closer to his home, he noticed more trees with bullseyes with arrow in the center. And he says, "Well, there's got to be someone around here who thinks they're very good. I'm going to show them." So he goes into the town and he sees on the post office a bullseye with an arrow in the center. And near the supermarket on the wall, a bullseye with an arrow in the center. Even on the church wall, there's a bullseye with the arrow in the center. So he becomes enraged and he goes to the elders and he says, "I want to see that person who's got this perfect bullseye. I want to meet them tomorrow morning at sunrise." And so the archer shows up at sunrise. He's waiting and waiting. No one shows up, with the exception of a little girl. She's standing, she's muddied, she's got mud on her face, raggedy clothes. He looks and he says, "Oh, what's she doing here?" So the young girl says, "Can I help you? Are you looking for something?" And he said, "Well, I was supposed to meet someone to challenge in an archery, but they're not showing up." He goes, "What are you doing here?" She says, "Well, I was supposed to meet someone here because the town elder said there's a man who wanted to meet me." So the archer kind of looked and said, "This is unusual." And he said, "Well, I need to know who is that person who's been making perfect bullseyes." And the young girl says, "Well, that's me." And he goes, "How can that be you?" And she says, well, I'll tell you, that's easy. I take my arrow, I draw it back with my tight in the bow, and then I point it and then very, very straight, let it go, and wherever it lands, I draw a bullseye. And the story goes, at that time his frozen heart, overwhelmed with peace and warmth and love for the young orphan girl, laughing with joy with tears in his eyes, he lifted the girl into the air and swung her round and said, come, let us go into the village and find a good home for an old man and his daughter.